This story takes place in the year 2000, when Jonah and some relatives were working deep in a forest near the rural outskirts of York County, about 50 miles from Lancaster. During that time, they had an encounter with a very frightening creature. Now, whether it was a ghost, some phantom, an evil, or a spirit, that decision is left to you guys. After hearing the story, do share in the comments what that creature could have been. So, what happened with Jonah and his companions? Let's unfold the story. In the year 2000, Jonah worked in logging. He and his brothers would take private contracts, traveling from place to cut timber. The cold days were upon them. On one winter evening, Jonah, his uncle, and his 4 brothers got a contract to cut wood in a forest about 50 miles from Lancaster, out past small countryside hamlets locals called Newberry Hollow and Little Oxford. It was around 4 in the afternoon. The foreman had shown them a stand of trees to fall. After cutting, they themselves had to load the logs onto a truck and deliver them back toward Lancaster. They pitched a temporary tent right there in the forest to rest between bouts of work. They started the work, and before they realized it, it had grown quite late. They decided there was no point in going back to Lancaster just for the night. Better to rest here, and once their strength returned later at night, they would begin loading the wood into the truck. This way, everything would finish a little faster. So, they finally decided to sleep right there. They gathered wood from around the site to burn through the night because the cold was biting hard. As they worked, around 8 p.m., a forest ranger passed through. Seeing them inside the woods, he called out, "Hey, it's already late. What are you doing out here? It's not safe to stay. It's dangerous. You folks should move along." Instead of asking him why, they laughed off his words and ignored him. That later turned out to be a very big mistake. The ranger felt slighted, as if they thought he was just making things up, trying to keep it casual, perhaps even to test their nerve. He added, "Okay, if you really plan to stay, about 6 miles from here, there's a local gathering folks call the Forest Rituals." Jonah knew they were new to these woods and could get lost easily. He refused the ranger's suggestion. But then Hank and Boone, Jonah's younger brothers, stood up and started to go with the ranger. Jonah stopped them. "This forest is new to us. We don't know the trails here. If you go with him, you won't find a ride back this late and you'll get lost." But Boone and Hank insisted. Wanting to see the forest rituals, they went with the ranger. They enjoyed themselves, dancing, booze, girls, and when the gathering ended, it was around 1 a.m. They had gone with the ranger, but now they had to return alone to the spot where everyone else was staying. And this time, they had to find the way back on their own. Jonah had warned them they might get lost. This was a new area, and no one could promise a vehicle would be available on the way back at that hour. But they didn't listen. Now, they had to return alone through a deserted forest path back toward Jonah. They asked the ranger for a rough idea of the route and how to get back to the campsite. They got the directions and took off. But they didn't know that along that way, a very dreadful incident was waiting for them.
They headed toward the spot where they had pitched their tent and where the logging work was underway. They kept walking, and after about half an hour, they felt they had lost the path. A little farther on, in the trees, they suddenly saw a very old, ruined house. Right in front of it stood a massive, dense tree, and just beneath it sat a very deep, old well lined with stone. When they saw that house, they were terrified. The whole place looked horrifying, uncanny. They understood immediately they had wandered into the wrong place. In that entire area, only near that big old tree, was the wind blowing fiercely. Everywhere else in the forest, there was no such wind. They were stunned. How could the wind rage only around that tree? Frightened, they turned back toward the highway spur they had crossed on the way in. To get to the gathering, they had crossed a highway. To return to the work site, they had to cross it again. Lost and circling, they once more reached that median-side pull-off near the highway and stopped there. They were shaken and confused. They had followed the path just as the ranger had described. But getting lost wasn't unimaginable. Perhaps they had taken a wrong bearing. So they set out again, this time choosing the opposite direction. After walking a while, the same thing happened. Despite heading another way, the same house stood before them again. There it was again, the ruined house, the massive twisted tree, and just beneath it, the same stone-lined well. Now they were truly afraid. This time they had approached from a different direction. Yet still, the same house and the same well confronted them again. Panicking, they ran back toward the highway side. Hank was now extremely scared. He refused to step back into the woods. He told Boone, "Let's stay here. We'll wait until daylight and then go in the morning."
But Boone, for some reason, felt as if his mind was being tugged by someone else's will. He wanted to go back in. "Let's go. We'll try another direction. Maybe this time we'll hit the right path." Boone pulled Hank into the trees again. A little farther on, the same house and the same old tree appeared before them. This time, the branches of that tree were thrashing violently, and the birds perched there looked as if they were desperate to flee. They peered closely at the place, and suddenly, from the middle of that tree, they saw a man, 12 feet tall, dressed in white, moving slowly toward them. They stared. The figure advanced, slow and deliberate. His eyes were red. His face was marked, clawed by something unspeakable. Boone and Hank felt their bodies go numb. Their blood ran cold. Then sense returned. They spun around and bolted toward the highway. As soon as they ran, the man in white, who had been advancing slowly, suddenly broke into a run, charging after them. While running, Hank fell. His leg ripped open, bleeding badly. Somehow, Boone hoisted him up and ran again. After some distance, that man, or ghost, whatever it was, stopped chasing them. Perhaps there was a boundary he would not cross. While they ran, they suddenly saw fire ahead, the very fire Jonah and his uncle had lit and were sitting beside. Finally, they reached camp. Breathless, terrified, They told Jonah and his uncle everything. Hearing the story, they were shaken, terrified, and yet they struggled to believe it. They comforted Boone and Hank as best they could, and somehow the night passed. In the morning, Boone and Hank insisted, "Come with us, see that place, it really happened." Boone, Hank, Jonah, and his uncle, these four went to survey the area. They took their truck and drove out.
And they saw that yes, there was a house in ruins. There was a big old tree and the well, exactly as described. Jonah later said that even in daylight, the place looked so frightening, so uncanny, that they felt smothered by a heavy, negative air. Their only wish was to leave immediately. Still, mustering courage, they went a little closer to the house and reached the big old tree. There on the ground lay heaps of dead birds. Seeing that, they were even more horrified. They had no strength to go farther. They started the truck immediately and returned to their logging site. The next day, they spent the whole day cutting wood, and in the evening, again, they slept in the forest. But this time, no one had the courage to wander. The shock of the previous day had not left their minds. Jonah said that around 1 a.m., while resting in his taxi, he suddenly felt someone sitting on his chest, squeezing his throat. He struggled hard, thrashing with arms and legs, fighting for breath for a long, desperate while. Finally, somehow, he slipped out of the creature's grip. After that day, they never returned to that area. Whenever contracts came from those woods, they refused the work. He says more than 20 years have passed, yet sometimes in his sleep, Jonah still feels as if something is pressing on his throat. One could call it sleep paralysis, perhaps, but the way it began, right after what happened to Hank and Boone, suggests it wasn't ordinary. Perhaps it was some energy that had attached itself to Jonah. So, what do you think that 12-foot figure was? Ghost, phantom, evil, or a spirit bound to the tree? Tell us in the comments.